So what we want to do is cultivate a capacity for kindness. So, close your eyes. Take a few moments to breathe in and breathe out. So what we want to do is cultivate a capacity for kindness. So, close your eyes. Take a few moments to breathe in and breathe out. How's everybody doing today? Welcome to another Healthy Gamer GG stream. My name is Alok Kanoja. Just a reminder that although I am a psychiatrist, nothing we discuss on stream today is intended to be taken as medical advice. Everything is for educational and entertainment purposes only. And if you all have a question or concern, please go see a licensed professional. Hello. So let me start by sort of saying, so I'm sick. So we took Monday off because I'm ill, but still a little bit under the weather. So I won't be able to teach meditation today because that's something that I was taught that I shouldn't do when I'm sick. We still have a lot of stuff that we'd like to talk about today. So we're here. I don't know, maybe I'll have to, if my voice gives out and stuff like that, I may have to kind of call it early. But there are a lot of things that I'm excited to talk about and I think need to be talked about today. So let's just run through that quickly. First of all, we're going to talk a little bit about Roe v. Wade and abortion. I don't really consider myself to be a political figure, so I'm not going to comment. I know it sounds kind of weird, but politically, maybe it is political. I don't really know. I just love to share my experiences being an actual medical doctor and like sort of thinking about abortion. So we're going to talk about that for a little bit. We're also going to talk about a couple of different things. So we're going to talk about fatigue. So I'd love to share with y'all just my perspective on fatigue, also some interesting things that I've seen as a doctor, as a psychiatrist, especially around people who struggle with fatigue. We're going to talk a little bit about, can you unblack pill? So we're going to talk a little bit about, once you start feeling bad, how do you change your mind? How do you change your perspective? How do you change your mindset? And what we're basically going to do is explore emotional processing. And I'm going to try to lay out for y'all in just a very summary kind of way, like what's the process of emotional processing? Because I think that we don't really understand this and it causes us tons of problems. And the last thing that we're going to talk about today is understanding numbness. So like if you're feeling numb in life, which I think a significant portion of our community feels, we're also seeing an increased amount of numbness in society. What's going on there? And we're going to take a little bit more of a neuroscientific approach. And there's some really fascinating studies that we'll sort of share and summarize and things like that about like, how do we understand why people feel numb? Does that mean they're depressed? Does it mean they're not depressed? Like what's going on? If it's not depression, how do I deal with it? So we're going to explain actually a little bit of neuroscience because there's a lot of very interesting translational research about it. Okay, so let's start with Roe v. Wade. For those of you that don't know, there was a landmark Supreme Court case in the United States. So this is going to be basically U.S. focused for our international audience. And, thankfully doesn't really apply to you. Hopefully it doesn't apply to you. But where the Supreme Court of the United States basically upheld the right to get an abortion. And so based on this case, it was like basically a federally protected ability to get an abortion. So today, the U.S. Supreme Court in a 6-3 decision overturned that case and basically said the states get to decide. So there's not a federal protection against abortion. It's a state-specific issue where states get to decide whether you can have an abortion or not. As a consequence of this, there are many states that, based on their political leanings, will basically outlaw abortion. So I'm not a political expert by any means. I have some political opinions, but it's not like my political opinions are more valid or than anyone else's. But I just want to share with y'all like a couple of stories and what I understand about abortion as a medical provider. So when I was on my obstetrics and gynecology rotation in medical school, I had a patient who had a fetus that had something called anencephaly. So anencephaly is an exceedingly rare condition. It happens to about 1 to 3 pregnancies out of about 10,000, right? So we're talking like, somewhere around 1 out of 10,000, 2 out of 10,000, 1 out of 3,000. Depends a little bit on ethnicity and there are other kinds of different variables. But anencephaly is a fetus that does not have basically a brain. So it's possible in the development of a fetus for you something goes wrong and they're born without the cranium, or not born, they're developing without a cranium and without a brain. So naturally what happened in this case is that, generally speaking, it's a reasonable thing for someone to have an abortion and terminate the pregnancy when you have a fetus that is completely unviable. So the fetus has a heartbeat, it just has no brain, and its capacity to live is like basically non-existent. So a lot of times these, the fetuses can be alive at the time of birth, but many times they're not. And then they all inevitably, I can't think of, or I've never heard, maybe there is I can't think of a single case where this will turn into a viable human being. So the first thing that I want to say is a medical doctor, like, there are absolutely reasons to get abortions from medical reasons. It's like there's no way, like, despite the fact that it has a heartbeat, there's no way that this will ever be like a human being. It's missing a brain, right? So like you can have, and essentially what happens is they go into cardiac arrest because the part of your brain that governs your heartbeat, there's a part of your brain that governs and keeps you breathing and governs your heartbeat, which is non-functional because it's missing, or it's like severely underdeveloped in people with anencephaly. And so like in my mind, there's no doubt that abortions are medically necessary at some points. Okay, that's the first thing. The second thing is that, generally speaking, there's also a lot of public health and epidemiologic data that restricting access to abortion it may reduce abortions to some amount, but what it really does is reduces access to safe abortions. And that women who aren't able to care for a child or aren't able to stay pregnant will seek abortions in other ways. So there are all kinds of kind of like homebrew kind of abortion techniques and things like that. People use the phrase coat hanger. But there's good evidence that shows that when you restrict access to safe abortions, what happens is people are going to like get abortions in unsafe ways. There's also all kinds of evidence that shows that restrictions on safe abortions disproportionately affect poor people. So what this means is that if you're rich and you live in a place where abortions aren't legal, what you'll probably do is just fly to a place where they are illegal, get a procedure in secret, and fly back. What happens though is if you lack means, like this is a law that disproportionately affects poor people who don't have the means to handle the abortion. And there's a lot of evidence, that's an overstatement. I've heard stories about, cases of this where people who are very anti-abortion, who have gotten abortions themselves, and in their case it was okay, right? But like all the abortions except for mine are morally reprehensible. I think we just sort of know, and then there's all kinds of other negative impacts. Like, so we see negative economic impacts. We see crime rates increase about a decade or 15 years after abortion becomes unavailable. So we'll also see similarly crime rates decrease 15 years after you make abortion sort of accessible. So I think from a medical standpoint, there are tons of reasons like ectopic pregnancies and stuff like that, where abortions are like medically, I wouldn't quite say necessary, but medically, there are cases where they're medically necessary, but I'm not an obstetrician. They're definitely medically like reasonable cases for abortion. And so I think these kinds of blanket protections are important to preserve those kinds of things, because I don't know that lawmakers, so first of all, like a lot of the people who are passing laws don't really consider medical evidence when they pass laws, right? So they'll sort of say like viable heartbeat, for example, is something that I hear a lot. Is sort of a dividing line. But like, what about the case of anencephaly? And so this is the kind of thing where like, I think it's a real unfortunate thing that the Supreme Court has done. I think it's like going to disproportionately affect people who are poor. I think it's not going to be good for our society. I think it's not going to be good for potentially fetuses or prospective mothers. And it's really unfortunate. Like I mean, if y'all want to talk more about it, I suppose we can, but I don't really have much more to, in a sense, I have a lot to say, but in a sense, like it's pretty open and shut, at least in the medical community, about the importance of abortions. Like, I don't think that there's a whole lot of debate amongst actual doctors about the importance of this. So like, but like doctors are not necessarily lawmakers, and like that's, I think, okay in a sense. I just wish that lawmakers would really consider medical science a little bit more when they instituted policies like this. Yeah, I think it's unfortunate. Yeah, so I think this, just also remember that. So here's like basically what I kind of think about it. It's like, okay, if you want to outlaw abortion, at the minimum, like this is my basic problem in terms of like policy, is that people don't play the tape through to the end. So it's like, what happens to that child when it's born? So if you've got like a 16-year-old who's like has a kid, like what happens to the child? What happens to the mother? Like, do you have maternity leave? Do you have childcare services? Like what happens? And I think we sort of learned this in medicine, where so we decided at some point as medical doctors, which is a good decision, that we're not going to let someone die. So when you come into the emergency room with a heart attack or whatever, we don't care what you did prior to coming into our doors. We're going to do our best to save your life. So this is like really important. It became also pretty important during COVID when people, were like anti-vax and didn't get vaccinated. And like, as a doctor, like, do you let that person die because it's their decision? No, you don't. So we have a simple rule in medicine, which is that we're going to try to help people no matter what. I think it's a great rule. The problem is that rule creates some interesting issues. So the first is that if we're going to provide emergency services, and when someone comes in, we don't ask you, like, can you afford, cardiac ICU time? We're going to save the person's life. The problem is that when we do that, it's very expensive. So as it's very expensive, like someone has to eat that cost. It's generally speaking eaten by the taxpayer. This is also something that people in the US don't really understand, is that without socialized medicine, we have socialized medicine already. The difference is we just have a very, very, very expensive form of it. So let me walk y'all through like what happens. And I guess this is a tangent that we're going on. So if a homeless person comes in with severe heart disease and a heart attack, we put that person in the cardiac ICU. We provide care for them, right? Because we're not going to let people die. That's the line that we've drawn in the sand. We're going to provide people with care. Then let's say that the ICU costs $100,000 in terms of the stay. So the patient can't pay because they're homeless and they have no money. So then who eats the cost? The hospital eats the cost. If the hospital keeps on eating costs, if they keep on providing $100,000 worth of care and never get reimbursed in it, what happens? The hospital goes under, right? Because you can't keep on giving free care without getting like paying, for your ventilators and nurses and doctors and all cleaning people and all this kind of stuff. So then what the hospital does is goes to the government and says, hey, by the way, we're going to go out of business because there's a bunch of uninsured people that are getting life-saving medical care. The government says, okay, what do you need from us to not go out of business? Because we as the government need you to exist, right? Because otherwise our populace can't get medical care. And the hospital says, we need this amount of money to stay afloat because of the care we're providing the uninsured. And the government says, okay, fine. And then they pay that money. And where does that money come from? It comes from taxpayers, right? That's where the government gets its money. So we're already subsidizing this care. Now, the real problem is that if we had started that person on medication for $40 a month, like if we had started this person on a statin, we had started them on a blood pressure medication, if we had provided this person with $1,000 of medical care over the last 5 years, it would have saved us $99,000 in ICU care. But we don't pay for that because this person can't afford it. So this is one of the reasons why the United States has one of the best healthcare systems in the world in terms of like the quality of particular procedures and outcomes that we can deliver, and it is so bloated and expensive. So the value of the United States healthcare system is low. Like, so that what you get for what you spend is actually inefficient. But what you get is excellent in terms of like the quality of care that we provide, if that makes sense. And so this is my basic issue with a lot of like healthcare policy, is that I think you've got to, like, if you're thinking about, socialized healthcare and stuff, it's not about, like, we're already doing it. People don't seem to understand this. Like, people don't get it, that it would just be cheaper to, like, astronomically cheaper to provide this person with medical care longitudinally for free. Like, we would save money. We would save like 99 grand in this scenario. Right. And so it's like, it's just such an inefficient system. And so this is the thing about medical policy, is that, like, I think you got to play the tape through to the end. So, like, even if you want to make an argument for being pro-life and, like, not letting people get abortions, like, what happens next? Right. That's what I think is really unfortunate about, like, all these policies. Like, you got to play the tape through to the end and account for all of the consequences for your law. And that doesn't happen. And so then what we sort of end up with is situations that are just, like, objectively worse. Like, we could do objectively better. We could save a life, provide a greater quality of life, reduce morbidity and reduce mortality, and save money doing it. I don't know. It's, like, kind of simple, TBH. So Wonder Chimp is asking, the preventive care price isn't wrong, but don't hospitals only recoup 70% of the cost of a Medicaid stay? The rest is covered by inflating costs to private insurance? Yeah. In essence, yes. So a lot of times hospitals will lose money on certain payers and make money on other payers. But there are other advantages of Medicare and Medicaid. So, for example, like, Medicare will pay. They'll pay on time. Private insurance will, like, fight you for like 3 or 6 months, and then they'll pay you more. So there's all kinds of, I mean, it gets super complicated, which is part of the reason that the healthcare system is so messed up. Basic problem with the healthcare system in the United States, in my opinion, is that the person who spends the dollar has no recourse if their dollar is misspent, right? So, like, when I purchase a candy bar, if I don't like the candy bar, I have the option to not purchase it again. So what this does is guarantees some amount of feedback between me and the candy bar producer, where if they make their candy bar too small or they make it taste too crappy, I'm going to stop buying it. Basic issue is that this feedback mechanism is not in place. Right? So when I have employer-based health insurance, like, if I'm unhappy with my health insurance, I can't quit. Right? Like, I can't do that. So when you have a fundamental, like, when I pay $1 to you and you pay $1 to someone else, and that person provides me with healthcare, that triangle sort of situation is, like, not conducive to, because there are altered incentives. So that's a basic issue. Okay. Enough about that depressing crap. So maybe we can, if Maud's around, I see Tech Tellers around, can we do a quick poll to see what we want to cover first? So here's what we're going to deal with. So chronic fatigue. We're going to talk a little bit about chronic fatigue. We're going to talk about, do you guys ever go through periods of feeling nothing? So how to handle numbness and how to understand numbness from a neuroscience perspective. And I'm slowly believing into this black pill stuff. How do I not do that? And this is going to be a conversation about how to manage emotions and emotionally process. So what do y'all want to start with? Fatigue, numbness, or emotional processing? And in the meantime, thank you for the Prime sub. Krishnan64, we appreciate it. Okay, great. So we're going to do fatigue first, and then we're going to do a little bit of the numbness. The black pill, and then we'll end with numbness if we've got time, okay? All righty. So let's talk a little bit about fatigue. So what I want y'all to do is put up your hand and raise all 5 fingers. And as I'm going to make statements. And if the statement applies to you, I want you to put down a finger, okay? So the first is, who out there feels tired? If you feel tired, put down a finger. Who out there wonders, so who out there has difficulty sleeping or their sleep is kind of messed up? Put a finger down. Who out there thinks that therapy may not be actually very helpful to them? Like if you're concerned that your tiredness is not really like, maybe like therapy won't fix, or you've tried therapy and it doesn't fix, put a finger down. Last is, do you watch motivational videos, but they don't seem to help? Put a finger down. And last is like, do you feel like you're there's something in you that's just not right? That's something that's not normal. It's kind of busted. You kind of look at everyone else and you're seeing them like just have energy, but you just don't seem to have that energy. Even though you enjoy what they enjoy and they're your friends and you guys are the same age and they have a degenerate lifestyle and you have a degenerate lifestyle, something just seems off and you just feel like something's scuffed. If that's the case, put a finger down. Now, if you put down at least 2 or 3 fingers, hopefully we'll educate you a little bit about what's going on and actually educate you all about fatigue. So let's take a look at this post. Okay? So, how do I treat chronic fatigue? So the first thing that we're going to do is renew our disclaimer that we're not going to talk about treating anything medically today. What we're going to do is educate y'all about chronic fatigue. I've been chronically fatigued ever since I can remember, but it got really bad when I was 15 that I started skipping school a lot. I talked about it to doctors and therapists, and they linked it to my mental health issues. And yeah, I had a problem. I worked on my mental health problems for a long time, and I can say I'm in a really happy place in my life right now. Good for you. Regardless, my happiness isn't giving me energy. I have a lot of motivation and things I want to do, but I always end up lacking the energy to take initiative. Sometimes I stay in bed all day, not even depressed, no negative thoughts either, just chilling until I feel like I don't have to drag myself to do basic activities. I've taken blood tests and things alike, but nothing came out of the ordinary, so the problem got disregarded with try visiting a psychologist. The only thing that's working for me is excessive amounts of caffeine, but my tolerance goes to crap because I heavily rely on caffeine. My sleep is fantastic. I sleep 12 hours a day, and it usually gives me a rush of energy in the morning that only lasts 4 hours, and then I need to drink coffee or I'm going to be in bed and completely frozen in place. Any tips on how I overcome this? So this is something that's really important to think about. I'm going to just pause for a second because we've got a garage opening. Isn't 12 hours too much? Absolutely. We'll get to that in a second. Okay. Can y'all hear the garage door close, by the way? Okay. No. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about this scenario. So sometimes we feel really, really exhausted. And when we feel really, really exhausted, we'll do the right thing, right? You go to a doctor, they're going to do some tests. And then at some point, what many of them inevitably do is they say, okay, this problem is due to mental health issues and you should go see a therapist. And then what happens is you go see a therapist and you work on your mental health issues, but it doesn't fix the tiredness. And there it is again. I'll just wait until it ends. So this is a really common scenario where people feel really tired. They go see a doctor. Their doctor runs some tests, does some evaluation, does some sort of gauging what's going on. And then they sort of conclude that there's nothing wrong with you. So what you should do is go see a therapist. And then you'll go see a therapist and they'll help you with some stuff. Like maybe there is some depression and things like that. But then like At the end of that, you've done the therapy. You're not really sad. You just don't have any energy. So what I'd love to do today is talk to y'all a little bit about something called chronic fatigue syndrome. So the first thing to understand about chronic fatigue syndrome is that it affects a ton of people. So chronic fatigue syndrome may affect as many as like 8.5% of the population. So this is where there's like, it's kind of an emerging illness that we're not really too sure about. And so like about 8.5% of people will describe being chronically fatigued for a period of about 6 months as a duration of fatigue. So they've felt this way for at least 6 months. The interesting thing is if you do a clinical evaluation on these people, about 10 to 20% of people meet clinical criteria for chronic fatigue syndrome. So the estimates of how common chronic fatigue syndrome is somewhere between like 1 and 2% of the population on the low end, or as high as close to 10% of the population. We're not really sure because as this person discovered, and as you may discover, the awareness of chronic fatigue syndrome, even within the medical community, tends to be pretty low. And so what they end up doing is they like test for what they know how to test with. You're not anemic. Your thyroid function is okay. So go see a therapist, i.e. it's all in your head. So I myself have gotten tons of patients who have been referred by general practitioners or like primary care physicians who will be like, okay, this person is tired. Like I think they need psychiatric help. Here's the thing. So I'm a psychiatrist. What that theoretically makes me is an expert in mental illness. So what that means is that theoretically I should be able to recognize when someone is mentally ill and when they're not, right? Like just generally. And what I found shockingly is that a lot of these referrals, like these people aren't mentally ill. They're not like depressed. Maybe there may be features of depression. We'll talk about that in a second. But generally speaking, like I know what mental illness looks like. Like I understand that the physical doctor, your primary care physician, wasn't able to find anything wrong with you. And then this is the other problem that happens is when they can't find something wrong with you, who do you send them to? You send them to me, right? You send them to the therapist. You send them to the psychiatrist because if it's not, we can't find anything physically wrong. That means it must be up here. But being an expert, arguably, okay, in mental illness, what I've been shocked to discover is that like these people are not mentally ill. They may have some consequences from their fatigue that make it look like depression. Like you're feeling sad because you can't get out of bed physically, but that's like a chicken or egg sort of thing where in my estimation, a lot of these people are not mentally ill first. And that's what happens because that's something we're trained to look for, right? So one of the features of a depressive episode or major depressive disorder is actually feeling like very tired. But not everyone who feels tired and has normal lab values have depression. Sometimes what they have is fatigue. And so what I'd love to do today is actually talk to y'all a little bit about what we've discovered about chronic fatigue syndrome and how it's actually like a physiologic thing. It's not in your head. So what we're going to do is, let me think about how I'm going to do this. So I guess we're going to just use the iPad. So let's talk about chronic fatigue syndrome. Okay. I'll put this over here for a second. Oh, actually, no. I'll put this over here. And we're going to do this, and then let's do this. Okay? So let's start with chronic fatigue syndrome. So the first thing is that the prevalence of this is somewhere between 1 to 2% and somewhere around 8.5%. So I recognize that these are really, really common. I mean, these are, very, very different numbers. And that sort of depends on which study you look at and stuff like that. I personally suspect that it's higher than 1.2%. That could be a bias because once again, I'm a psychiatrist and then like these people get preferentially sent to me. But I suspect that there's a lot more kind of going on here. The really interesting thing is that as the awareness of this diagnosis is increased, what we've actually started to do is like pay attention to, what's going on with these people and start to look at some studies. So here's what we found. Okay. So from a pathophysiology standpoint, what the term pathophysiology means is like looking at what's wrong with these people. What we actually discover is that there's a lot of different dysfunctions. The first is that there's some kind of immune dysfunction. So there are studies that have been done on people with chronic fatigue syndrome, which essentially show like alterations of like natural killer cell activity and things like that. There may be some kind of like low grade inflammation. And I don't know if y'all have felt sick, you know, like even if you're kind of like getting over an illness, or when you're not really like have a full blown illness, you have this low grade inflammation, you just kind of feel like weak and you don't feel like doing much. So that's something that we've seen as we look at people with chronic fatigue syndrome. Second interesting finding, this is really interesting, is that there's a hypometabolic state. What does this mean? So there's a ton of physiology research on hibernation. So when animals hibernate, their physiology changes a lot, right? So if you think about a bear that's hibernating in a cave, like their physiology changes to like not do much and sort of sustain over long periods of time. The interesting thing is that if you look at some papers, I will just pull this one up, for example. By the way, this is a paper from the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. I found this one just for you, chat. Metabolic features of, look, this is PNAS Plus. Metabolic features of chronic fatigue syndrome. So the key thing here is that there are 20 abnormalities in metabolic pathways. And is this the one with the Dower state? Hold on, let me make sure. Yeah. So the Dower state is essentially a state of hibernation. And what this paper basically talks about is how the metabolism of people with chronic fatigue syndrome is more similar to like this hibernative state. So if we think a little bit about what's going on in this situation, it's not in your head, it's that your body's metabolism is in like almost a hibernating state, which sort of results in like low energy and like difficulty doing things. The next thing that we've sort of seen is that people with chronic fatigue syndrome have sleep activation changes. So what this sort of results in, we'll just kind of flash to the paper real quick. Sleep structure and sleepiness in chronic fatigue syndrome, with or without coexisting fibromyalgia. And essentially what we tend to find is that there's alterations in the sleep architecture. So this is a situation where basically people are getting less restful sleep. And then also the amount of sleep is altered. So this can be either high or low. And sleeping 12 hours a day is generally speaking not considered normal. Okay? Now this is the next thing that we found that was very interesting. So, you know how generally speaking in society, we're all super stressed out all the time? So everyone talks about, or not everyone, we especially, you know, a lot of people talk about stress hormones like cortisol. So what does cortisol do? Cortisol is a primary stress hormone that sort of results in like hyperactivation of your body and mind over a period of about 24 hours. And when we're in a chronically elevated state with cortisol, we'll see things like difficulty sleeping, we'll see changes to our weight, our blood pressure goes up. We have all these negative things from stress hormones that are too high. What's really fascinating is in chronic fatigue syndrome, what we actually find is impaired activation of our stress system as opposed to overactivation. So actually what we have is in states of chronic fatigue syndrome, we have low levels of cortisol and low levels of CRH, which is corticotropin releasing hormone. Okay? So essentially, like if we think about stress hormones as activating us, right? Like fight or flight, sort of reducing the amount that we sleep at night because our reticulating activating formation is like kind of hyperactive. Cortisol basically amps us up and gives us energy. And so in chronic fatigue syndrome, what we actually find is impairment of the activation of our stress axis. So we don't really see hypoadrenal stuff, but it's almost like your stress hormones are like inactive. And so the stress hormones are actually what provides a lot of energy for us, right? And then the last thing that we're going to talk a little bit about are serotonin changes. So we also know that in chronic fatigue syndrome, we see alterations, the insulin-like growth factor we didn't talk about, but that's another thing. So what we sort of look at in the endocrinology of chronic fatigue syndrome is that there's low circulating cortisol, which we talked about, disturbance of central neurotransmitters. So this is talking a lot about serotonin. And then there's also a relationship between cortisol and neurotransmitter function. So essentially what we sort of see is like alterations in our neurotransmitters as well. And this is part of the reason why sometimes people who have chronic fatigue syndrome, doctors will refer them to psychiatrists, because in some of these patients, definitely not all, and I don't even know if the majority, you can do things like antidepressants, which can help. But this is really important to understand, that the reason that antidepressants help is not because this person is depressed and that the fatigue is caused by depression. It's because chronic fatigue syndrome has independent activity on serotonin, which sometimes supplementing with medication can help, okay? Very different. It's not primarily a mental illness. It's that in the state of chronic fatigue syndrome, we see all of these different alterations. So why are we talking so much about this? The short answer is because this ain't in your head, right? So if you feel this way, if you feel tired, if you're like, oh my God, like I lack motivation or I struggle with motivation or like my sleep is all messed up. You're sleeping 12 hours a day. You're sleeping 4 hours a day. If you look around you and you're like, man, like what's wrong with me? And then furthermore, if you're in this camp of people who have either tried therapy, been referred to therapy, or sort of think that like therapy may not work for you, you won't be wrong. This isn't a problem on your end, right? If you tried therapy, were referred to therapy and you don't feel better, it's not because you didn't do it right or therapy doesn't work for you. It's because you may have chronic fatigue syndrome. And I don't know how many people are like in chat right now. And I don't know, this may get uploaded to YouTube at some point. Like we may have, a certain number of views, but we're talking about 1 to 2% to about 8.5% of people who are watching this video or watching this stream right now may actually fit into this category, right? So this is not like, it's not all in your head. There are real physiologic changes that we could sort of start to see that result in chronic fatigue syndrome, okay? And part of the problem here is that when you get told that this is in your head and you get sent to see a psychiatrist, by the way, psychiatrists, I don't know if you guys know this, but psychiatrists don't get trained in treating chronic fatigue syndrome because it's not a mental illness. So we get this situation where patients are getting referred to mental health professionals. And remember, this is like a physiologic problem, right? So that's even a psychiatrist. The psychiatrist at the least is a medical doctor. Like we know physiology. Whereas if you go see a therapist who's like a clinical social worker, a master's in counseling psychology, or a PhD, they're not going to know any of this stuff, right? Because they're not trained in physical medicine or physiology. And so the more we sort of see referrals there, like they're not even aware that this is a diagnosis because you get like no formal training in that. So this is sort of what I discovered as a medical doctor when these people come to my office is this person does not need a therapist. That's not actually what the problem is. Now, therapy can be useful, and we'll get to that in a second. But this is a huge problem because there's like underdiagnosis, inappropriate referrals, and then where does that leave you? Like, okay, so medical treatment doesn't work, therapy doesn't work, I guess I'm screwed. Good news is no, you're not, okay? So let's talk about what to do for chronic fatigue syndrome. So once again, this is not, so chronic fatigue syndrome really requires tailored treatment. And that's where like, not everyone with chronic fatigue syndrome has the same problems, but what I'd love to do today is just share with y'all some basic things that I've learned as a medical doctor, psychiatrist who works with patients with chronic fatigue syndrome. This is where, unfortunately, we don't have a medicine that fixes it. We don't have a test that picks it up, and we don't have a medicine that fixes it. There's still a lot that you can do. So the first thing that I want to do is give you hope. So about 77% of people with chronic fatigue syndrome, if I have day 0, or let's call it day 1, okay? Day 1. If I measure a bunch of people, okay? And at day 1, if 77% of people meet criteria for chronic fatigue syndrome, okay? This is I know it's kind of weird, but this is out of a population who feel tired. It's 6 months, oh no, sorry. Hold on, I did this wrong. Let me start from the top. So at day 1, 100% of people meet criteria for chronic fatigue syndrome. I'm super tired. It's 6 months. 77% of people meet criteria for chronic fatigue syndrome. Doesn't look great. At 2 years, 33%. First thing to understand about chronic fatigue syndrome, it doesn't get better right away. It takes a long time to get better. So we're not really sure what's going on. This hibernation phase, hypocortisol phase, kind of things like that are, like it takes a while. We don't really know what causes it. We don't really know like what happens. But the first thing to understand is that if you've been feeling this way for like a year, it's like you're not screwed. Now, if you've been feeling this way for 10 years, then things are a little bit trickier. There's still stuff you can do. Now, this statistic is one of the more optimistic studies. There are less optimistic studies, which will find that like at 3 years, you still have 80% of people who are feeling pretty bad about themselves. Like they're bad or not bad about themselves. They're still feeling quite fatigued. So there's some like, variance here in terms of what sort of happens. But in my experience, a lot of people do get better. It just takes a long time. Okay. So that's the first thing to understand, is that there is hope out there. Okay. Next thing to understand is what seems to work. So there have been studies on things like diet. Diet doesn't seem to consistently help people. I'm not saying that it won't help you. What I'm sort of saying is that even if we look at this pathophysiology, we're assuming that chronic fatigue syndrome is actually one problem. But chances are it's actually a cluster of different physiologic disturbances. And depending on which constellation you've got, if you've got number 1, number 2, and number 5 versus number 3 and number 4, or number 4, number 2, and number 5, different treatments may work for you. Does that make sense? Like it's not all going to be the same for everybody, right? Like that's basically like a takeaway. So the first thing that's important is sleep hygiene. So what do we have good evidence for? So sleeping well is like really, really important. So this is the kind of situation where if you're sleeping for 12 hours a day, you may need to see someone about getting a sleep evaluation. So sometimes when we're sleeping too much, that could be due to different kinds of like sleep disturbances, right? So obstructive sleep apnea is a good example of this. Narcolepsy is a good example of this. There could be like other physiologic things that are interfering with your sleep. So being able to sleep well and sort of having a good sleep hygiene appears to improve things for chronic fatigue syndrome. Here's the other interesting thing. So psychotherapy can be effective, but it's not the primary treatment. The biggest way in which psychotherapy is effective for chronic fatigue syndrome is when I've got chronic fatigue syndrome, it's hard for me to do stuff. When it's hard for me to do stuff, I do less. As I do less, life starts to suck. Right? And this is where depression enters the picture. So maybe clinical depression enters the picture, but just generally speaking, feeling bad about yourself. This is where therapy can help, or psychotherapy or counseling, right? Specifically, so there's CBT studies that have been done that are basically to deal with the consequences of the chronic fatigue. So it's just like doing CBT for a patient who has cancer, right? It can still be helpful, but don't confuse whether we're dealing with a consequence of the illness or we're dealing with the core of the illness itself. And so what some people assume is that therapy works up here, but it doesn't work up here. It actually works down here. So this is why it can still be useful, but that's just sort of because like you kind of need all the help you can get, right? You can't afford to have low mood if you have hypoactivation of your like stress axis. Like you can't afford to like have low mood anyway. So for those of us that kind of fluctuate in terms of our mood, we can kind of get away with it because, our hypometabolic state, our sleep activation, our stress hormones are basically all normal. So you just basically don't have that bandwidth to kind of get rid of. The other really interesting thing is there's this thing called progressive exercise therapy. So basically exercise. So that's where it's kind of really challenging. But if we look at some of these physiologic changes, like our hypometabolic state, for example, stress hormone activation, sleep stuff, exercise helps with all of these. So I know it's kind of like tough to sort of say this, but it turns out that exercise is actually very effective for chronic fatigue syndrome. And that's the kind of thing where when we call it progressive exercise therapy, what we sort of mean there is that like we know that you've got low energy, right? So it's like going to be like physically difficult. Your energy metabolism makes it hard for you to exercise, which is actually okay. So that just means we have to start really, really, really small. And so at a minimum, our first target is going to be 30 minutes of exercise, 5 days per week. This is one of the few cases where we actually want heart rate less than 100. Let me move that around a little bit. So it's like actually okay to start with something like walking for 30 minutes. So you don't necessarily need a highly elevated heart rate. And then what we tend to find is that the more that people exercise, like the more it actually balances this kind of stuff. So I don't know if y'all know this, but for example, let's just talk about one simple benefit of exercise. So if I have a lot of adipocytes, fat cells, what that does is make me resistant to insulin. So insulin is what causes blood sugar. Sugar in our blood to go in our cells. So here's a cell. Here's blood sugar. Normally, I secrete insulin. And what insulin does is move the sugar into the cell, right? So we take it out of the blood. The more fat we have, the more our body is like, oh, actually, we have adequate energy reserves. So the more fat we have, the more we inhibit insulin's activity. So our cells become insulin resistant, which means that this process doesn't happen, which means that sugar piles up in our blood. As sugar piles up in our blood, it does all kinds of things. It affects our mood. It causes microvascular damage. It causes macrovascular damage. This is why people with diabetes will have like nerve problems. So the nerves in their distal parts of their body, so fingers and toes and feet, will actually start to die off because of the toxic effect of too much sugar in the blood. Now, here's something that's really cool. When you exercise, okay, our body is like, oh crap, we're exercising. So we're going to shut off all of this circuitry. And I don't care whether you have insulin or you are resistant to insulin or whatever. We're exercising, so we need energy. It's like an override switch for your insulin system, and you start absorbing sugar from the bloodstream. So exercise has all these different kinds of physiologic activities, and especially physiologic override switches for metabolism. This is why exercise is so healthy in terms of obesity, type 2 diabetes, and things like that. It's essentially an override switch because our body is like, I don't care about all that energy metabolism stuff. We're running right now, and we absolutely need to keep running. You can go F yourself, insulin system. That's what exercise does. And so for some of these hypometabolic things, because we don't have a pill that you can take that's going to snap you out of the hibernation mode. So if we even think about this for a second, like let's say I'm a bear and I'm sleeping in a cave, and like human beings walk into the cave or another bear shows up. I'm going to override all of my hibernation metabolism and like I'm going to start becoming active. Does that make sense? Because I have to. So for a lot of these override switches for sleep and even stress hormones, so for example, when we exercise, we're going to need to increase our heart rate and our blood pressure. And guess what increases heart rate and blood pressure? Right? So as we get these signals, we start to flip all these override switches, and it starts to really help with our fatigue over time. Now, the interesting thing is that when we exercise, okay, if you have chronic fatigue syndrome and you exercise, you also get something called post-exercise malaise. What does this mean? This just means you feel like crap every time you exercise. Okay? So this is the tricky thing, my experience with patients has been when they don't understand this, because a lot of y'all will have tried to exercise. And what you find is like, oh my God, it feels so bad. And so this is where like patients need to understand, right? So when I work with my patients, what I'll explain to them is, by the way, exercise is going to make you feel awful. It's going to take you a couple weeks to a couple of months. But here's what I think is going to happen. When you exercise consistently enough, this crap takes weeks to fix. But what you're going to have to suffer through is weeks of post-exercise malaise. And so it's kind of crappy, but that's why you got to do whatever you can for as long as you can. And what I tend to find with people who sort of engage in these simple things is that, they do get better. We're not saying that it goes away entirely. I'm not saying that they get cured, but we'll see substantial reductions, or they'll have good weeks and bad weeks, which is very common. And oftentimes the good weeks will far outweigh the bad weeks. So we're sort of talking about once a month, they'll have a week where it's really hard to do stuff, but the other 3 weeks of the year that are the month, they're actually doing really well. Last thing that I want to talk a little bit about is complementary and alternative medicine. So this is where, I practice a lot of evidence-based complementary and alternative medicine, right? So I teach yoga and meditation and stuff like that. This has good data behind it. I'm a trained energy healer. I do not do energy healing on my patients because I don't think that the data is consistent enough. That being said, I would say about 50% of my patients with chronic fatigue syndrome get some kind of benefit from doing some kind of complementary and alternative medicine. So what we're talking about is meditation, yoga, and Tai Chi. These are probably the things that help the most, and this is specifically pranayama. But I have actually had a significant number of patients who describe or endorse benefit with something like acupuncture. The challenge is that the data is not really there to support this, and or energy healing even. So a very good personal friend of mine benefited a ton from energy healing, and he's had chronic fatigue syndrome for over a decade. The challenge here is that with some of these interventions, first of all, the data is not there. And the reason for that, I believe, is because there's a high variability in practitioners. So we don't really know if this stuff is real or not, but there isn't consistency. So what I'd say for people who are interested in trying this stuff is, by all means, try it, but recognize that it may not work, and recognize that it sort of is the luck of the draw whether you get a good energy healer or a bad energy healer. Part of the reason that I think that energy healing studies don't show good results is because we as a scientific community don't have any way to tell the difference between a good energy healer and a bad energy healer, which in turn may simply be because it doesn't exist, right? So how do I tell the difference between a healthy unicorn and an unhealthy unicorn? I can't, because they don't exist. You can't do a veterinary exam on any unicorns. So that's where there's either a lack of sophistication in our science, which I personally believe there's something to this crap, right? Because we know that the systems that are based on this theory of energy will outperform exercise in terms of some clinical outcomes. So they were on to something, but it's not clear whether the energy actually exists or not, or they just sort of figured something out where it's correlates with something else. Is it placebo effect? We don't know. The short answer is we don't know. The reason that I include it today is because a lot of people, what happens if you have chronic fatigue syndrome, you'll go see a doctor, they can't help you. They'll recommend a therapist, they don't help you. And then you're looking for some kind of help, so you're let me try this. And that's where I have seen I've seen good improvement with some of my patients who try some of this stuff. I can't recommend it, but if you're open to it, I think and you want to give it a shot, it's not that it never works. It's just that we can't consistently predict whether it works or who it works for, or whether the providers are good or not. But that's where stuff like yoga, meditation, and Tai Chi, that's a lot safer in terms of making a recommendation. Okay? So that's chronic fatigue syndrome. At the end of the day, just to kind of summarize, sometimes we get tired. sometimes it feels like something's wrong with us. We're sleeping, our sleep is messed up, we feel fatigued. Like, it's not necessarily mental in nature, but sometimes medical professionals will think that it's mental in nature because they can't find it on a test. And they'll think, okay, since your test must be normal, it must be coming from the one place where we can't measure anything. And so they send them to me. You go see a psychiatrist or therapist. Really unfortunate, especially if you go see a therapist who's not trained in physiology, because they may not be aware of this diagnosis. And then, like, therapy doesn't really fix the problem. It can help in some ways, right, which we talked about, but it's physiologic in nature. And so that's chronic fatigue syndrome. Unclear how many people it affects. Somewhere between 1% and 9% of the population. I suspect that it affects more people than the 1 to 2%, which is sort of the conservative estimate. I think it's probably closer to 5 to 8%, personally. And so if you're in this kind of situation, you should absolutely go see a medical professional and talk to them specifically about this diagnosis. Ask them, hey, do I have chronic fatigue syndrome? The other thing that it turns out you can do is, like, if you start sleeping well and exercising, I know it's kind of like a duh, just sleep well and exercise. But there's a big difference between just sleep well and exercise, and understand that there's a physiology at play here, which these two things actually counter. And there may be a role for therapy or other kinds of treatments which are going to be tailored to you. So sometimes antidepressant medication can work. Sometimes there are even like, not glucocorticoids, but there are other like sort of like stress hormone related treatments, which can be effective for some people. So there's a lot of different stuff out there you can try. Meditating and yoga and Tai Chi are, generally speaking, going to be safe. And then if you're interested in exploring other things, just understand that while some patients do get benefit from it, and some of them get a lot of benefit from it, it's not consistent enough to be able to be detectable in a scientific study, which either means that there's a high variability of energy healers, for example, or simply that energy healing is not a real thing. Right? We don't really know. What's the relationship between, Holly Ann is asking, what's the relationship between chronic fatigue and burnout? I generally think about these things as completely independent, but I would not be surprised if we studied the physiology of burnout, which we're nowhere near doing, that we discover that the same pathways that are messed up in chronic fatigue syndrome are also messed up in burnout. The difference, though, is that we know, for example, that people who are burnt out oftentimes have chronic hyper-elevation of their stress axis. Whereas what we see in chronic fatigue syndrome is hypoactivation, right? So we see depression versus elevation. So there's some things that I think physiologically are going to be quite different, but I would not be surprised to see disturbances in all the same places. So Skolton97 is saying, I have ME/CFS. Graded exercise therapy has been debunked as a dangerous treatment and found to be damaging to people with ME/CFS. Overexertion can permanently worsen it too. That's news to me. So, and as Colton says, this has been an ongoing issue for years in medical bodies being slow to change their recommendations. If that's the case, then, so this is based on the literature searches that I've done. If you've got when you say that graded exercise therapy has been debunked, I'd love to see studies about that. There are certainly cases where medical treatments have the opposite effect. But let's see if we can. Debunked is a strong word. So let's see if we can figure this out a little bit together, chat. Okay. So let's do this. Progressive Exercise therapy and chronic fatigue syndrome review. So this is published in 2018. Okay. So this is a review that was published in 2018, the effect of physiotherapy on fatigue and physical functioning in chronic fatigue syndrome. So this is physical therapy treatment. This isn't progressive exercise. Exercise therapy for chronic fatigue syndrome. Let's take, Cochrane. There's a Cochrane review. Perfect. This is the best it gets. Okay, main results. Exercise therapy lasted from 12 to 26 weeks. 7 studies used aerobic exercise. Control groups consisted of passive control, CBT, whatever. Author's conclusions. Exercise therapy probably has a positive effect on fatigue in adults with CFS compared to usual care or passive therapies. The evidence regarding adverse effects is uncertain. Due to limited evidence, it is difficult to draw conclusions about comparative effectiveness of CBT, adaptive pacing, or other interventions. Okay. I can get behind that. So in general, I find Cochrane reviews to be an excellent source of information. So I'm also not surprised that some people have had negative adverse effects from this kind of stuff. And the truth of the matter is that when it comes to things like chronic fatigue syndrome, it is a very understudied condition, right? Like even if we go to the premise of it is that it's missed a lot. So generally speaking, I don't recommend that people do things that hurt them. So I've seen this also in the case of things like exposure therapy, where we know that exposure therapy is an effective treatment for a phobia, but I've absolutely seen cases where too much exposure therapy can traumatize someone and have the opposite effect. This is exactly why we're sort of offering general education and not medical advice, which is why the specifics of your case should absolutely be addressed with a medical professional. But thanks for sharing your perspective. Okay, next up. Yeah. Okay, untaking the black pill. All right. Let's move on. Okay. So, all right, let's get started. So I'm slowly believing the black pill stuff. How do I not do that? Black pill adherents believe that looks are genetically determined and that women choose sexual partners based solely on physical features, lookism. So whether or not a person will be an incel is predetermined. There's this YouTuber called Wheat Waffles that's just talking about this stuff, about how looks matter the most, and it feels like it makes sense to me, and he's not the only YouTuber. It's just making me down and a little resentful of living and kind of sad. How attractive guys get more of a free pass and how ugly and average guys are seen as creepy. It's a lot to digest, really. I have also seen videos of Tinder experiments with average and attractive guys, which just prove the point further. Also, how women, even ugly ones, only want to date the top 10% chads of guys. My current source of interacting, if you can call it that, with women is Tinder, which isn't really getting me any matches. I'm a shut-in failure at life. I don't even want relationships on Tinder, just friendships, and that is still asking for too much. But I'm not sure. Maybe I just want to cuddle with a female and hold hands, but that's relationship stuff. I don't want sex because of asexuality. I'm kind of looking for some counter evidence because I don't like thinking as a black pill. But if that is reality, then what am I supposed to do? Maybe something about how looks don't matter, I don't know. At this point, I should get surgery to change my height and facial structure, or better learn how to be isolated from females and be alone with video games. I'm also autistic, so if looks don't matter, I feel like I'm doomed to forever. So this is kind of challenging because sometimes we feel hopeless about something. And what's happened is on the internet, we have support communities, right? So I want y'all to kind of think about this from the top. So if I'm hurting about something, let's say I'm starting to take the black pill, and I feel those negative emotions, what I'll do is gravitate towards a community that validates my experience. And as I gravitate towards that community, I feel better. But then sometimes what can happen is the community itself can become toxic. So we've seen this in our own community where sometimes if you go to our subreddit, it's a pretty hopeless place. So we have a lot of people coming for help. And we have a lot of people who are trying to help them. But essentially, if you like read even our subreddit, which is supposed to be like a mental health positive, validating, accepting place, what it does is it draws in people who are like burnt out and frustrated. And then they lean on each other for support, which is absolutely what communities are supposed to do. The challenge is that if we're not careful, we see this a lot, and there's actually data to support this, which we'll talk about a little bit, is as this starts to happen in a community, it actually worsens our mental health and distorts reality even more. We have a common phrase for this now, which is an echo chamber. You'll see this in political discussion, discussion places. You'll see it on 4chan. If you have a discussion about the quality of League of Legends on a Dota forum, there'll be a very uniform, how do I believe that League of Legends is not worse than Dota? I hang out on a Dota forum. Or you go to a League of Legends forum and you talk about Dota, you're going to get the opposite result. Everyone there believes this too. So if you want counter evidence, let's just unpack this for a second. The first is that none of this is actual evidence. These are YouTube videos. YouTube videos are not evidence. They're just YouTube videos. So if you want simple evidence that this statement is not true, I want you to just go to a park where there are people who have kids, or go to a grocery store and look at how attractive are the parents. Because if women are only willing to date the top 10% of guys, what you should find is every mother has a father who's like in the top 10% of handsomeness. Right? Like, that's all you need to do is just go outside and look at who has kids. So what you'll discover when you do that is that this statement is patently false, right? If you want, it's not even an experiment. It's like this. Experiments are like scientific studies that are controlled and have variables and blinding and randomization. That's a study. That's how you get data. We've also looked at a study recently on AI that sort of determined what's the most likely thing that leads to high quality in relationships. And it's actually belief that your relationship is good. So success in a relationship doesn't have anything to do with income or this or that. Actually, that's not true. That's an overstatement. But it's not all this stuff that people think it is. And the question is, why do people think this stuff? People think this stuff because of things like YouTubers, right? So if I watch 10 videos from Wheat Waffles and Wheat Waffles believe something, I'm going to start to think that this is real. And then what I'm going to do is join a community of other black pillars, because who watches Wheat Waffles? It's already people who agree with him. So human beings gravitate towards things that they agree with. And so then what you're going to have is this community where everyone is saying the same thing, and then you form an echo chamber. So this is not really evidence at all. I've also seen videos of Tinder experiments. What were the controls for their Tinder experiments? What was their sample size? What was, and then the other thing is that you're making a big assumption that success on Tinder correlates with success in relationships. Where we've actually had recent posts where people even were like, Dr. K misses the point. Tinder is toxic and is terrible. Tinder is not necessarily about relationships, I think. I mean, I don't really know. But like Tinder is not, it's just one slice. Like I also want you to like look at people who are in relationships and how many of them met at on Tinder. For thousands of years, people have been forming relationships without Tinder. And even today, it's unclear to me what percentage of people who are getting married today met on Tinder. I'm not saying Tinder is bad. Let's just be honest about what Tinder actually accomplishes and what it doesn't accomplish, and whether it is a good proxy for relationships or success in relationships. Okay? But what I want to talk to you all about today is this person's actual question, which is, how do I not do that? So let's understand the process of emotional processing. Okay? Because this is something that is underexplained. So everyone talks about validation and emotions, but what we don't actually talk about is like, if you have negative emotions, like how are you supposed to deal with them? Like what is the process of dealing with our negative emotions? So the first thing to understand is, here's me. And something happens. Let's say I have some kind of experience. And this leads to a negative emotion. And then what happens is I go to a community, right? So like, I start to believe these things. I start to black pill. And so I'm going to engage in the black pill community. And I feel hurt. And so I go to the black pill community, and here on the internet, we see this in our community as well. So there's a lot of people who will validate my emotional experience. And so what happens is the negative emotion gets validated and vented out into the community. But participation in the community, if you read black pill posts over and over and over and over and over again, what's going to happen? I'm going to start to feel worse. Right? So participation in the black pill community is a source of both venting emotions and actually receiving negative emotions. And if you look at mental health communities on the internet, what we tend to find is that everyone there is talking about acceptance and validation, but no one knows how to process. So essentially what it becomes is like, it's like a room full of people who are farting. And it's like, I'm going to fart and it's going to get distributed throughout the room. So it's not like stuck within me, but then everyone else, it's like, people who struggle with farting convention is what the internet becomes. It's like, hi, my name is Alok. I struggle with farting. I fart. And it's like, oh yeah, man, that's tough too. And then like that person farts. And then like eventually like we're just in this room that becomes like full of farts. Okay. Right? Because no one is teaching it. Like all I know is how to like fart it out of my butt. I don't know how to open the window. So they don't teach us the rest. You all get that? So it's like, it's kind of bizarre because even the communities that are trying to help, hey, we all struggle with this problem of like passing gas. So like other people don't understand this, but like you understand this. You're my fart bro, right? Or you're my fart girl. That just don't Google that, please, God. So because we share this problem. There's like the people out there who don't struggle with passing gas, and then there's us, and then we all get together, and then like, then we're like, it kind of helps because we understand each other, but then we also like get their negativity too. And we've even had posts in our community of like, I just can't stay here anymore. Like this is too bad for my mental health. So how do you deal with this? Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about the steps of emotional processing, okay? So when I have these negative emotions, so I participate in this community, and as I get these negative emotions and I get this evidence, right, which, by the way, this isn't real evidence. It's just sensory input. It's like if I subscribe to a bunch of flat earther YouTube channels, it doesn't mean that the earth is flat. I will think that there's a bunch of evidence that the earth is flat, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the earth is flat. Y'all get that? I can subscribe to a bunch of YouTube channels about reincarnation. And I can start to believe that, oh, look at all this evidence, all these stories of reincarnation. Doesn't mean it's necessarily true. There's like science and experiments and evidence. And then there's people talking on the internet. Those are not the same thing. Okay? Doesn't mean that there isn't value to those things. There can be value to YouTube. Hell, we're on YouTube. But just because something is on YouTube doesn't make it true. Shocking, I know. So then the question is, and I really appreciate this person's post because it's like, they're like, how do I stop this, right? How do I break the cycle? Because I think that's exactly the kind of courage and insight you need. This person is recognizing, okay, like they're seeking counter evidence. They're stepping out of the echo chamber. And they're coming to our community and saying like, hey, like help me step out of this echo chamber. So it's awesome that they did that. I think it's a huge step forward. So now what we're going to talk about is what do you do when you experience negative emotion? So this is what we do with it. Here is my negative emotion tube. So as I get all this negative emotion, what happens is I take that negative emotion and then I pack it in here. So I'll usually distract from it, right? So I've got negative emotions venting out. I've got negative emotions coming in. And then over time, as I experience negative emotions, like I'm not really processing them, right? So what I'm going to do is distracting behaviors like video games or even watching YouTube, right? So there's evidence that this stuff suppresses our amygdala, limbic system. There's all this negativity in my mind. And in order to function, what do I need to do? I need to pack it in. Okay? As I pack in more and more negative emotion, something interesting starts to happen. Keeping it buried requires more effort. So the more full my subconscious gets with negative emotion, the more energy it takes to suppress it. This in turn decreases our motivation and available energy. Does that make sense? It's like a load on our mind. Okay? And so like then we start to see something really interesting, which is that if you go to these communities that have a lot of negative emotion in them, their members have difficulty actually doing stuff, right? No one's going out there and saying like, okay, just talk to more people. Like if Tinder isn't working for you, like go do this stuff. And this is where the concept of just comes from. Just go do this. Why is just hard? It's because we have so much energy spent suppressing our negative emotions and distracting ourselves that like we don't have any bandwidth left over for other things. The other problem with this is that the more full this is with negative emotion, the more we have to go into distraction. And interestingly enough, the more likely things are to overflow. Okay? The more likely things are to overflow, what this essentially means is that it doesn't take much to trigger our negative emotions. So what this means is that people who are in this kind of cycle, all it takes is a single conversation, let's say with a woman, to like create an eruption of negativity. And then that becomes a self-fulfilling cycle too, because when this negativity erupts, like you can't talk to the person anymore because they didn't respond to your text within 5 minutes. And then like you feel really hurt and all of this negative emotion starts to well up. Okay? So now what we sort of see is that it's very easy to get triggered because there's all this pent up emotion. And we keep on distracting from the emotion, so it gets stored even more. And then the more that it gets stored in our subconscious, the more energy we have to spend, like suppressing it, right? And that creates this current situation. And the more that we get triggered by our negative emotions, what is our experience? There's me, I'm I'm walking around, and then suddenly there's angry me. And it doesn't take much to do this. And then what happens is like, this makes it hard for me to re-engage with life. And then I become angrier and angrier and angrier, right? And then like it gets worse and worse and worse. And then like we have an angry, hopeless, negative emotional black pillar who can't do anything in their life and is just in a state of doom and gloom because they're getting triggered so easily. It doesn't take much for all that emotion to get like overwhelm you. And the more that the emotion overwhelms you, the more you retreat into video games or distraction or whatever. You spend time in that community, you vent that anger, and every other person, boy, do you let what a gigantic fart rip. And everyone else in that room smells that, and they're like, oh, that's terrible. Right? And so you'll get these like rant posts in these communities, and you'll get people making YouTube video after YouTube video after YouTube video about how terrible everything is. And where is that coming from? It's fundamentally coming from the fact that this emotion is just built up and has nowhere to go. So, how do you stop? So if we look at the process of emotional processing, it involves 3 steps. Appraisal of emotion. Okay. Second thing is, let me think about this. Third thing was regulation. What was number 2? I'm blanking for some reason. Can't believe I'm blanking on this. Okay, so it involves appraisal of emotion. Regulation of the emotion is number 3. It'll come back to me. I blame the illness. It's sort of not too relevant, but we'll get to it in a second. Okay? So from a neuroscience perspective, we've got like parts of our brain that are aware of emotions. And we have parts of our brain that modulate emotions. Oh, here's what it is. Interpretation. And regulation. So we've got parts of our brain that modulate our emotions. And then we've got parts of our brain that modify our emotions. Okay? So the first thing that you've got to do in this process is become aware of the emotion. So what are you feeling? Okay? Like, you feel angry and stuff like that. And then once we feel angry, sometimes what we'll do is we'll vent, and that'll decrease our emotion. So that's one thing that you can do. And when people offer validation, that can also decrease this emotional energy. So that can both of those can work. But then this is usually as far as people go. This is where there's another really important step, which is explore the origin of emotion. So when I get triggered by something, when I watch a YouTube video and the rage comes boiling up, what I want y'all to remember here is that each segment of this rage that comes boiling up actually came from a particular experience, right? So some of the rage came from this experience, some of the rage came from this experience. Each of these experiences causes a little bit of rage to come up. And as we distract, instead of acknowledge and process, the rage just builds up. And then what we do is it comes boiling up, and then we suppress it again, but it's there next time. So what you tend to find is that people can get triggered by the same stuff over and over and over again, right? Like, so it's like if you don't process, you're going to continue getting triggered. So this is where, in our coaching program, we teach our coaches about how to find the origin of a samskar. So samskar is like bottled up emotional energy. This is stuff that's thousands of years old. We do this stuff in therapy as well, but this is just a fundamental of how the mind works. So samskar is a concept from like ancient yogic psychology about this basic idea that anytime we experience emotions, whatever we don't process gets stored. And then whatever gets stored can be recalled. And so if you ask someone out on a date and you're very, very, very anxious about that, what you'll recognize is some of that anxiety is coming from that experience, but some of that anxiety is left over from the last time you asked someone out or tried to ask someone out. And some of that is coming from the time before that and the time before that. And there was you had a crush on someone in the 7th grade and they ended up dating your best friend. And so like some of that leftover emotion projects onto this relationship. And this is what we kind of call emotional baggage. So we even know this, right? So we'll say like, oh, why didn't that relationship work out? Oh, that person had too much baggage. They had too much relationship baggage. What does that mean? It means leftover emotions that have not been processed, and they project onto the current relationship and make this relationship more difficult than it objectively is. Okay, so explore the origin of the emotion. Start to recognize in the moment that some of what you're experiencing is actually not from this person. That you're not just angry with this person, this is anger that's left over from the past person. And as you do that, as you become aware of the origin of the emotion, you'll start to treat this person differently. And then what you'll do less of is sabotage this future relationship. Okay? Next thing that you've got to do, this is really important, is as you gain awareness of the emotion, this emotion is going to push your behavior. As you acknowledge and recognize the awareness of the origin of the emotion, what you need to do is intentionally alter your behavior. So I'll give you guys a simple example. So there's all kinds of like stuff. If you guys have seen the nice guys subreddit, right? Someone like doesn't respond to my text and I say, hey, I'm a nice guy. They don't respond for a day, and then I start calling them all kinds of nasty things. Nice girls exist too. It's not just, it's not a gender issue. So what happens is in that moment, the nice guy, they give in to that emotion and they start cussing out the person that they're talking to, which in turn ruins the relationship. It's not even a relationship potentially. And then that in turn is going to cause another samskar, which in turn is going to fill up our emotional bucket even more. So what happens is nice guys become nicer and nicer and nicer with each interaction that they have, which in turn actually means they become nastier and nastier and nastier. So what you've really got to do is alter your behavior in the moment. And don't send that text message. But in order to just don't send the text message, it's not that simple, right? If I was just don't send it. No, the way that you overcome your impulses, the way that you manage that is actually by the discovery of the exploration of emotion and the awareness of the emotion in the present. Because oftentimes when we give in to emotions, we're not even aware that we're feeling them. Okay? The last thing that you've got to do is reintegrate your negative experiences into identity. So we had a lecture on post-traumatic growth a couple months ago now. And one of the key things about trauma, so trauma is like a negative emotional experience, right? The interesting thing is that when you process trauma properly, people feel stronger than when they started. And so a good example of this is the idea of a cancer survivor. Getting cancer sucks. When you first get cancer, you start to think all these negative things. Why me? Life is terrible. I hate God. I no longer believe in God. I started believing in God, and God is an ass. There's so much stuff I want to do. It's filled with all these negative emotions. And then some people wallow in that and they stay stuck. Other people will like integrate that into themselves. And what they can actually do is, okay, if I've got 5 years left, I'm going to make the most of it. So when experiences affect us, if we're not careful, they alter our identity. And then we can go through the process of reinterpreting that and reintegrating like that experience into our identity in a healthy way. And so this sort of involves cognitive reframing. And this is where the identity of someone like a cancer survivor arrives, right? So I use that as an example because it's a good example of like something that happens very commonly, where people will say like, okay, I'm a cancer survivor. If I survived cancer, I can definitely handle this. And then suddenly what that person, like, even though cancer is definitely not a good thing, that person actually looks to the future like more resilient and with like more hope and capability than if they had never had cancer in the first place. And this step, we definitely don't get into if you're in a black pill community. How does this happen? This happens as a consequence of emotional work and self-reflection and like talking about who you are and stuff like that. This is what coaches will sometimes help people do. Therapists can help people do this as well. Sometimes you don't need either of those things. It's just like you hike and you spend time with yourself and long, dark nights of the soul. But then you start to think about yourself differently, right? So instead of thinking about yourself as a black pillar or doomer, you start to think about yourself as I'm someone who has struggled in relationships. And as you start to alter your behaviors and you stop sabotaging your relationships, you are going to form relationships. And as you form relationships, you're going to start to change the way that you think about yourself. And then instead of someone who is doomed to never have a relationship, right, which is sometimes what we see here, right, like how attractive guys, blah, 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 like and then like I'm a shut-in failure at life, like this has got to change. And as you start altering your behavior and as you start engaging in things in life, you'll start to realize, basically, I mean, this is, I see a lot of myself in this person. So I was like, 18, 19, started to get into the pickup artist scene myself. I had a friend who was super into it. And I was like, oh, I need to like, and then the pickup artist evolved into red pill and then evolved into black pill and incels and stuff like that. And so I started blaming other people for my shortcomings. And then as I started to make alterations in my life, I reconceptualized that. And now like the biggest reconception is I understand this person to some extent. Therefore, I'm grateful for those experiences because my hope is that I can help them. I'm an incel survivor in a sense. Because then I discovered, oh, actually like all of those thoughts and feelings are like, I completely understand where they come from. I experience them as well. And they're not necessarily true, and there's a way to get out of it. So if you want to learn how to like get out of this cycle, what you've got to do is process your emotions. The thing is, thus far, the internet has figured out how to validate emotions, but hasn't figured out how to process them. So what we end up with is these like collections of people who share the same problem, vent their emotional energy. It gets absorbed by everyone else in the community. As the rest of the community absorbs that negative energy, they in turn vent it themselves. And then we're in a room full of people who struggle with passing gas and fart too much. And then that actually weighs us down. And we get confused because we were told that talking about it is supposed to help. And I did talk about it. Why isn't it helping? And then the very community that is supposed to support us actually makes us feel worse. And that's because we're missing some key steps in emotional processing. The first is to be aware of the emotion. The second is to understand the origin of the emotion and recognize this cycle of every time I have a negative emotion, do I suppress it through something like video games? Do I give into it by lashing out to people? You have to recognize, okay, what am I feeling right now? I'm feeling hurt and rejected. I'm feeling unlovable. That's why I'm calling someone the C word or the B word or whatever. That's why I want to hurt this person back because this person hurt me. If you get slapped across the face, what do you want to do? You want to slap the other person. Be aware of the emotion. Once you become aware of the emotion and once you recognize, oh, like some of this hurt is actually coming from all of my previous rejections. The wild thing is they weren't even explicit rejections. As you start to go back and you explore the origin of the samskar, and this is the work that our coaches do, you start to reinterpret and you start to realize, and y'all will see me do this. So like, for example, if you look at some of our interviews with incels, right, we'll like help them reinterpret their prior experiences. Instead of interpreting it through an emotional lens they start to really interpret it through a logical lens. The problem is that everyone who is controlled by their emotions thinks they are thinking logically. Whereas the truth of the matter is they're not thinking logically at all. It's just hard for your mind to recognize that. That's why it oftentimes requires help of an external person to help reinterpret that experience. As you become aware of the origin of the emotion and you become aware, oh my God, there's all of that emotion from all my past rejections coming up, you can alter your behavior. As you alter your behavior and stop sabotaging your attempts at connection with other human beings, you'll start to form relationships. As you start to form relationships, you can start to reintegrate your past experiences into yourself in a healthy way. And that's how you untake the black pill. Gotta process those emotions in a nutshell. The other thing to consider is that spending time in that community. So how do I get rid of the smell of farts? How do I stop smelling farts? Getting out of the room helps a lot. So even though it is emotionally validating to spend time in some of these communities, it doesn't actually help you in the long term. And even though it's nice to spread your fart around other people, you're smelling all of theirs, and that may not be a good idea. Okay. This is also a problem that sometimes we encounter in group coaching. So we see this sometimes where group coaching essentially turns into like negative venting sessions without any sense of like progress or growth, where people are just, like venting negativity. And then the air in there can get very oppressive. And hopefully, our coaches are sort of have some amount of skill in managing this, where I'm actually thinking about putting together a specific emotional processing curriculum for group. But it's like something that happens a lot where it can feel really oppressive. And then it's the coach's job to help you work through that stuff and like do those processing steps, challenge your viewpoint, start to think a little bit about like how to view your situation differently. But sometimes it can get dark. And it's a valid concern, valid complaint. Absolutely. And speaking of which, so someone actually recently sent me a list of concerns that people have about group coaching. So I just wanted to talk about those for a minute. So here are some reasons that people don't believe in group coaching. The first is I'm not going to get personalized advice, therefore it won't be helpful. And other people are going to give me advice that doesn't work for me. So the reason that group coaching is so hard to explain is because there's no advice. So people come into group coaching. We saw this a lot in our high performance group where people came in and they were like, someone was a CEO of a company and they're like, this is not what I expected. I thought I was going to be with other CEOs and they were going to give me tips on work-life balance. Like, I'm not getting any tips. So my first question to you is, when people give you advice, how effective is it in changing your life? It's not. People come there looking for answers. The internet is full of answers. And have we solved motivation in the human race? So people come expecting an answer, and that's what's so confusing about it, is we don't give you one. Because it's our belief that giving answers doesn't actually help people. What helps people is understanding why you can't take the advice. So group coaching is about understanding yourself. Now, this is where people say, but like understanding myself, like if the goal is understanding me, shouldn't I do personal coaching? Why should I do group coaching? And I'm going to make this very simple for y'all. So if you're watching this and you're a part of our community, have you talked to Dr. K? Have you benefited from anything that we've ever done? But how is it possible for you to benefit if you've never talked to Dr. K? Very simple. This is where the AOE healing concept comes in. So here's Dr. K. Here is the person that we interview. Person that we interview has a problem. when we talk to this person, does this person benefit? Yeah. But then here's all y'all that are watching. Do you benefit? Yes. Why? You're not the one who's interacting. So this is really important to understand. When you see your problem in someone else, it becomes a lot clearer. Holy crap, I'm doing it. Because you're not subjectively caught up in the emotion. It's your problem, but it's in someone else. So it's actually easier to understand. If this principle were not true, AoE healing and we would not be a thing. Do y'all get that? So it's really interesting. Because what I want y'all to do is think about this for a second. When I finish interviewing someone on stream and I ask them, what have you learned today? They're like, I have no clue. But if I ask Twitch chat, what have you learned today? Y'all have clear answers, clear takeaways. You can see it clear as day. You're not caught up with all the crap that they were going through. Do y'all get that? It's like there's like each and every one of you will take away something from each of these streams. And it's because of this concept. When you work one-on-one with someone, the subjectivity and the experience of emotion makes it hard for you to learn lessons. This is why group can be valuable. Because it actually engages, what a lot of people think is that personal coaching is closer to what we do on stream. I actually think, ironically, group coaching is closer to what we do on stream. Because in terms of your perspective. So if you get something out of watching streams and out of watching videos, why is that? It's because you're the observer out here and you're learning over here. It's kind of a bizarre concept that not many people get. Okay, next thing. I will not have enough time to share my problems and time will be split among the group. That's a fair point. So if you need one-on-one time, personal coaching is better. No question. But I think that the whole point of group coaching is that your problems and someone else's problems are actually the same friggin' problem. Once again, if everyone needed individual help, this would not be a thing. AoE healing would not be a thing. The whole point, the premise upon which our Twitch channel, our YouTube Healthy Gamer was founded is that we share the same problems. And if we come together and work on them, like we can actually solve them together. What I saw, the reason I started streaming and this whole thing is because it occurred to me that working one-on-one in my office was not enough. And that there's a certain scalability to this that is absolutely necessary right now. And that same spirit is embedded into our group coaching program. Here's the next one. I will be required to solve other people's problems and I can't solve my own problems. How will I help others? Really, really valid concern. I can't even help myself. How the hell am I supposed to help someone else? Let me ask you something. Is it easier to cook for yourself when you're sick or cook for someone else, one of your friends, when you're sick? What actually brings out who can you work harder for? Can you work harder for yourself or work harder for a friend? So here's the wild thing. It actually goes the other way around. Helping others can sometimes be the first step to helping yourself. We see this a lot in the substance use community. That like, we're gonna come together and support each other and try to help each other stay sober. And like, that actually is how you figure it out. When you talk to your friend, let's say I'm in a community of people who are black pillars, and I offer words of hope and encouragement to a friend, like to one of my peers in group. That's where I learn how to say those things. And it's easier to see respect in other people and give respect in other people. How do you change that self-dialogue in your head? You start by changing the way that you talk to other people, because it's easier to talk to them. It's easier to look at someone else in group and say, even though you screwed up, you still have value as a human being. It's just a setback. Really hard to say that to yourself. So how do you learn how to say it to yourself? You actually learn the words by saying it to someone else. And then what happens as a group is you see the intrinsic value in all 7 people in the group, but you still don't see it in yourself. And then they see it in you, and you're still confused. And then one day, hopefully your facilitator or someone else in group is like, hey, what do y'all think about that? Who here thinks that they're the least helpful person in group? And everyone in group raises their hand. And that's when it clicks. Holy crap, how is that possible? Like, what's going on here? The problem with personal coaching or therapy is if your therapist is like, you have value, what do you say in response? What does your mind say? Your mind is like, you're paid to say that. So there's interesting study. The respect, so if you poll programmers, okay, developers, whose respect matters to you the most? It's not your boss. It's your peers. The respect of peers is the most impactful thing for your sense of value. And we know this. We've discovered this. This is what all the research from the United Nations, World Health Organization, US Surgeon General about peer support is all about. It's like if one of y'all talks to Dr. K, and Dr. K is like, you're a beautiful human being, you have intrinsic value. You're like, F you, you're Dr. K, of course you're going to say that. You say that to everyone. It doesn't even mean anything coming from you. Y'all get that? But when it comes from your peers, it means something. It's like if I'm playing a game of Dota and I ask my mom, Mom, do you think I'm good at Dota? And my mom is like, yes, beta, you're so good at Dota. Look at how talented you are and smart you are. You're so good at Dota, beta. You're the best Dota player in the world. But when my friggin' peers in the Dota game are like, damn, son, you were amazing at this game. I once had someone tell me after a game of Dota 2, I wonder if I can even find the screenshot. I don't know where screenshots go. I'll try to find it. I used up all of my good teammate luck for the year in this match. Best piece of feedback I've ever gotten in a Dota game. All of my good teammate luck is gone because I queued with you. The respect of your peers matters so much more. I'll try to find the quote. Okay? Next problem that people have in group. I will feel lonely in the group because others won't be able to understand what I'm going through. If that were true, once again, this would not be a thing. The whole point is that we feel isolated. And when we give into that feeling, no one else will be able to understand what I do, and we don't ever engage in a group, we never give ourselves the chance to disprove that belief. And we go on reinforcing the belief that I am alone, I am alone, I am alone. The value in group comes from coming into group believing you're alone and leaving realizing that you're not. How does one realize that they're not alone in this world? It has to come from a group. It has to come from your peers. Even if you have one-on-one sessions with Dr. K, you think one-on-one time with me is going to make you feel less alone? Like Dr. K is the one person in the world that understands me. That's because it's Dr. K. But the rest of the humans out there, there's no way they could understand me. So how do you change this idea that I'm alone in this world? It's got to be through some kind of group interaction. When you share your problems, that's why AOE healing is a thing. Because every person who comes on here thinks that they're alone, thinks that their problems are unique. And then everyone watches and they're like, you know what? We struggle with this too. I won't be able to participate because I have difficulty speaking and I'm shy. This is a great one. This is probably my favorite one. You know what? That is correct. If you are shy and you have difficulty speaking up, you are going to have trouble in group, which is exactly why we made it. Because let me give you the options. There's you, who's shy and has difficulty speaking. There's the real world, in which speaking up and looking like an idiot and sounding like an idiot has real consequences. You can't afford to speak up at work and look stupid in front of your boss because that can affect your pay. You can't afford to go to the birthday party because if you look dumb at the birthday party, then they're not going to invite you next time. There are real consequences to being shy and speaking up in the real world. If only there were a place where you could practice overcoming that emotion of shyness. If there were only a space that was non-judgmental, that did not affect your relationships, did not affect who you play games with, did not affect your income. If there was only a sandbox, a practice mode for overcoming, understanding those feelings, that would be cool. So here's you, here's the real world, here's group. It's specifically a place where you're going to feel shy. And this is one of my favorite things in group. So when we have a shy person in group, what do? I ask them, what helps you speak? Does it help if people ask you questions? Does it help if other people wear the burden of communication or carry the burden of communication with you? Yeah, it helps, but then it makes me feel bad. So it's like, okay, who's going to step in and ask this person questions to bring him into the group? One person is like, I'm going to step in. Cool. So then they start asking him questions. And the shy person is speaking because if someone talks to them, they'll talk back. I mean, they'll respond. But then the person feels guilty. And so we're like, okay, so now you feel guilty because the group is pulling you in. How can we deal with that feeling of guilt? What can you do to make things right? I don't know. Maybe I can ask other people questions. Fantastic. Is there someone else in the group who feels shy? Great. Can you ask them a question and bring them in? Even though I'm nervous, yeah, because I want to do my part in group. Ask them a question. Have a conversation. And then suddenly, the shy person is engaging someone else. Right? Then you feel guilty for feeling guilty, which is exactly why helping other people in the group is so crucial. The best antidote to feeling guilty for being helped by another human being is to actually help another human being. Because then you can say to yourself, yeah, did I need help? Absolutely. But I also gave it. I gave something back. And then you start living in the world not as an independent person who no longer needs help, because that's what keeps us stuck. I don't want anyone else's help. I don't need anyone else's help. I need to be independent. You start to change the way that you look in the world. And suddenly the world is about needing help, receiving help, and giving help. That's how this works. We're all going to help each other. So it's interesting because the very things that cause people to be afraid to sign up for group is exactly what group is designed to fix. But it's absolutely true. I'm not saying that talking in group is going to be easy. It's going to be hard. But where else are you going to learn how to do it? Where else can you show up and screw up and be welcome next week? That's why we have group. There will be a lot of time wasted because I have to listen to others' problems that I won't get anything from. This also we've addressed. This is the idea of AOE healing. The concept that you can learn from someone else's problems. And also that you can help someone else's problems. And as you help someone else get through it, you will learn how to fix it yourself. I'll feel worse because people will just be complaining for 90 minutes. That is absolutely a possibility. When this happens in group and when group becomes essentially venting session after venting session after venting session, without processing, without challenging, without, learning and growing, then group actually becomes more toxic than it's worth. It has absolutely happened. It's a very real fear and it's a very valid concern. It doesn't happen often, but sometimes the group becomes so oppressive and the facilitator actually lacks the skill to be able to steer it in the right direction. It's a valid concern. We've had people drop out of group because this has happened. What I can say confidently, though, is that that is not the majority of group experience. And I'd say that probably happens less than 5 to 10% of the time. We've had very few groups literally fall apart because of how oppressive the atmosphere is. I won't be able to find people who are successful enough to be role models I can learn from. Once again, you're not in group to learn from other people. If you want to learn from someone else, watch stream. If you want to learn from someone else, go to a class. If you want to learn from someone, group is not right for you. If you want to learn about yourself, group is right for you. if you want to see your problems existing in other people and learn what they did to overcome their problems, if you want to help someone else with your problem, then come to group. But if you're coming there for a curriculum, that's not the right place. We're actually still developing something like that, but if you're looking to learn from someone else, sign up for a class. Don't sign up for group coaching. Progress will be slow because I'm sharing time with other people. That's also a valid concern. So progress in group is actually slower than progress in personal coaching. But the kinds of progress that you can make are going to be very, very different. So overcoming shyness is way easier with your therapist than it is with group. Because I don't know if this makes sense, but like, here's you being shy. Here's you opening up to your therapist. But opening up to your therapist and opening up in the real world, there's a way bigger gap. Sometimes that feels insurmountable. Whereas here's you, here's group, here's the real world. Here's you, here's therapist, here's the real world. So even our data shows that the progress in group happens more slowly than in personal coaching. But in some ways, it's a lot more impactful. And in some ways, there are a lot of other elements to it that you can't get from even therapy or personal coaching. The respect of your peers, accountability, planning and action kind of stuff, overcoming shyness. And if you're looking for the fastest solution, it may not be the fastest. The data supports that. I wish I could say that they're equal, but the truth of the matter is they're not. The kinds of things that you'll learn in group and the kind of growth that you'll have in group will be different, though. The coach will coach each individual in the group, so I won't get enough time with the coach. If that's what you're looking for, it's a terrible idea. And when coaches try to coach each individual in the group, it does not work. It falls apart and is an absolute mess. Group coaching is not personal coaching with 7 people at the same time. Group coaching is about facilitating peer growth, understanding, and support. It's about sharing a problem, coming together, and AOE healing. It's because when you struggle with something, sometimes you can't get out of your own head, but you can see it better when you see it with someone else. When you learn how to support someone else who struggles with shyness, you're going to be training yourself in the self-talk that you will then say to yourself. It's not personal coaching with 7 people. And if that's what people are expecting, if that's what the coach tries to do, I kid you not, it just falls apart and is an absolute mess. It's just a completely different beast. Right? It's almost like an MMO where like the whole point is it's not like a single player RPG where you're controlling like 5 party members. It's an MMO where each person is bringing something to the table. It's just a completely different experience, right? And sometimes what'll happen, I don't know if you guys remember this, but like, multi-boxing in WoW. Like, so multi-boxing in WoW is kind of like personal coaching with 7 people at the same time. It's not a single player game. It's a MMO. The whole point is collaboration. And the experience that you have in an MMORPG is very different from what you have in a single player RPG. And an MMO is not a bunch of people playing single player RPGs. Does that make sense? It's like fundamentally a different kind of thing. Yeah, people don't, it's not the best analogy. Anyway, my voice is kind of giving out, so we're probably going to have to call it for today. But I think that some of these concerns that people have about group are like absolutely valid. That's the real challenge that we have is like, how do you explain to people that have only played single player RPGs what an MMO is? Right? It's tough. Because all the things that you think of in terms of like, it's about advice and this and that. No, it's none of that crap. That's what actually makes it so valuable. Because advice doesn't work. Role models are not what you're coming to group. Group is about peer support. right? It's not about some pro player telling you, yeah, you have a lot of Dota talent. Like, yeah, that feels wonderful. Don't get me wrong. But winning the respect of your people that you queue with is like completely different. That's what it's really about. I'm sorry that we don't have enough time to get to, I'd love to talk about this because I did so much research. Maybe we can speed run it. Okay, let me try speed running it. All right, speed run, chat. I'm going to try to keep this to 10 minutes. I can talk about it for half an hour, but whatevs. Do you guys ever go through periods of just feeling nothing? I'm not talking about seasonal depression or whatever. At least then you're feeling down and well depressed. I don't feel anything, period. I don't get angry when I feel like I should be angry. I don't feel accomplished when I feel like I've accomplished something. I don't feel pleasure, nor sadness, nor hate, nor anything. It's all emotions. It's like all emotions have been drained from me. I don't enjoy learning new things, and I'm not as curious as I once was. I don't feel anything when I solve an enigmatic puzzle. I used to enjoy watching anime, but now it's more like I don't mind watching anime. I feel like all of those things that define me, or at least used to. I feel no more than a shell. I'm 18 now, and I don't think I'm supposed to feel like a shell, right? I visited r/anhedonia, and I related to most of the posts to a scary degree. I want to say I'm scared to be living like this, but I'm not actually scared. I don't feel scared. It's just that I realize that this is not how it ought to be. I know that I don't want to be living like this. I feel like this has been developing for the past year or so, and I did get depressed from time to time, and at some points I was even suicidal, but the general decline towards anhedonia was always in progress. Mind you, this is all self-diagnosed. I never asked for help. If there is any hope I'm clinging to, it's because I occasionally feel something, but it's very faint. What should I do? Should I be concerned? Is this temporary? So, let's talk about this. Sometimes we feel numb. And the tricky thing about feeling numb, when we stop enjoying things, we don't even feel fear. It's like you look at yourself and you're like, man, I'm not really enjoying life. This should bother me more than it is. I should be concerned about this. I should feel fear. You even acknowledge that, like, you should be experiencing more negative emotion. But, like, you don't. And so it sort of bothers you, but you're not worried about it, right? Or you're worried about it, but you don't feel worried about it. It's like there's some part of you that's floating above, which is like, hey, this is not right. This is not okay. But the challenge is that normally when things in our life are not okay, that negative emotion can actually be motivation to go and fix it. Right? Where it's like, if you feel hunger, then you're going to go eat something. But if you have no appetite, that you don't, your body needs the food, but you're not driven or motivated to do it. So sometimes we feel numb. And then we talk about anhedonia. So anhedonia is a term that means the inability to experience pleasure. Anhedonia is oftentimes associated with clinical depression, major depressive disorder, or depressive episodes, bipolar disorder. And so the interesting thing is that we may think, okay, so like if I'm anhedonic, what a lot of people will jump to is that means I'm depressed. I need clinical treatment. But anhedonia is just a feature of depression. Just like insomnia is a feature of depression. Or weight changes are a feature of depression. It doesn't mean that all people who are anhedonic are depressed in the same way that everyone who has difficulty sleeping is not depressed. So anhedonia describes our experience, but there's actually studies on people who are anhedonic who are not depressed, for whom anhedonia is the primary problem. And I'd love to share with y'all some of the learnings of what those studies show and like how we can understand the situation, okay? So let's take a look at some neuroscience. This is some super cool translational research, by the way. So this is going to be my attempt at explaining if you should feel worried about your life, but you don't even feel worried, and you have difficulty feeling anything at all, what's going on? So the first thing, we're going to talk about 3 parts of the brain. Ventromedial prefrontal cortex, part of our frontal lobe. Nucleus accumbens, which is our dopamine reward circuit. And then third thing is going to be our amygdala and limbic system. Okay, which is over here. So this experiences negative emotion. This is essentially a controller. So what does that mean? So let's talk about anxiety. So when I feel anxiety, okay, so let's use the color yellow. So when I feel anxiety, this activates this part of my brain. When I get my anxiety under control, when I overcome my anxiety, my ventromedial prefrontal cortex inhibits this, basically overrides my emotion. So anytime we get control of our emotions, it's the ventromedial prefrontal cortex that controls it. The other thing that happens is as I get anxiety, this is going to go over here and control my behaviors. So the nucleus accumbens in the dopamine circuitry is what essentially governs behavior. It says, hey, go do this thing because it is rewarding. Okay? So it's like where motivation comes from. So if you're numb, we're going to start with a clinical observation, which is that when you numb yourself, you can't selectively numb yourself. It's just not how it works. We can't really selectively stop feeling negative emotions and just feel all the positive emotions. There are sort of ways that we do that. Usually drugs of abuse are good examples of this that will just increase your sense of euphoria artificially, right? But generally speaking, our natural intrinsic brain mechanisms cannot just numb all the sadness and just make us feel happy. Why is that? It's because the reason we've evolved to feel sadness is because it's actually like for survival benefit. So anxiety like helps us survive, sadness helps us survive, fear helps us survive. And so our brain actually evolved to experience happiness and sadness. So what's going on in people who are numb? What's going on in essentially the pathophysiology of people who are completely numb? So there's some really interesting studies that have been done. First is that this part, so now let's talk about numbness. Okay? This part is altered. This part is altered. Generally speaking, what we say is that when we want, and this part is altered too. Generally speaking, we want to strengthen our frontal lobes so that we can get control of our anxiety, and then we can act independent of anxiety. When you look at studies of people who are anhedonic, both with depression and without depression, what you find is alterations in this circuit. And essentially what we tend to see is overactivity of the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. When we meditate, we strengthen the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. But in people who are anhedonic, this is very, very strong. So isn't that a good thing? Because that's the goal of meditation. It's the goal of meditation if you're anxious. Because in the case of someone whose anxiety controls their behavior, their ventromedial prefrontal cortex is weak. In this case, it's weak. But in people who are numb, it's actually very strong. Now, why is that? Or what does that mean? What that means is that it's suppressing our emotions very, very powerfully. There's also other things going on where in people who are anhedonic, there's a really interesting study about the pleasure from sucrose. So if I take people and I give them an increasing sucrose concentration, so I tell them to drink something sweet, what I tend to find is that, let's say, normal people, let's say this is the pleasure threshold. So above this point, a normal person experiences pleasure. When someone is anhedonic, their pleasure threshold is here. Because they literally need more of the same stimulus to start to experience the same amount of pleasure. So to get 1 unit of pleasure, I need a higher level of sucrose. So what's going on there? That comes to the dopamine reward circuitry. This is lower. So what's actually happening is our ventromedial prefrontal cortex directs our attention. And so it almost compensates from a reward circuitry that's stunted by increasing its activity. Does that make sense? Because my ability to feel pleasure is weakened. So what I need to do is actually like ramp up this so that I can try to boost this. The interesting thing is when I ramp this up, it also numbs me out. So it's kind of weird that way. My ability to feel pleasure is negatively impacted. Therefore, my cortices try to compensate for the other parts of my brain. That's what the controller does. It's always trying to compensate, always trying to compensate. And so as it ramps up its activity, it suppresses everything else. So if you're anhedonic, let me see if I can actually find this paper. Yeah, this is a fantastic paper. Neurobiological mechanisms of anhedonia. Translational research. There's one thing that I want to show you all in specific. Neural basis of positive emotion. Neuropharmacology of anhedonia major. Yes. Neural basis of trait anhedonia in non-depressed subjects. Oh, you guys can't see that. There we go. This is the coolest part of this whole paper because it looks at anhedonia in people who are not depressed and figures out what's going on. So, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex for the processing of positive emotion is positively correlated. Okay? So we won't go into too much detail in the paper, but so if you're numb, is it normal? No. Should you be worried about it? Sure. Are you worried about it? No, because you're numb. What's going on? It's actually an interesting circuit of underactive reward circuitry, a compensatory change in your prefrontal cortex, and when your prefrontal cortex gets activated, it numbs your negative emotions as well. Basically. Oversimplifying, because the brain is complicated, there's no way you can reduce it this simply. So then the question is, what do we do about it, right? So where does the problem originate? Chat? What do y'all think? How do we reset some of this stuff? You need more anxiety? That's possible. It's funny. So someone's memeing, right? So what answers are y'all going to give me? Number 1, need more anxiety. You think you're trolling, but you're not wrong. Someone's talking about dopamine detox. Okay. Y'all are actually precisely correct. I can't even tell if people were being serious or they're memeing. So the first thing that you've got to do is reset this nucleus accumbens. Okay, so what is the most common cause of underactivity of the nucleus accumbens is dopaminergic overstimulation. So when I've worked with people who are anhedonic, and we sort of know this, right? Like, if I play a video game for 1 hour, it's fun. The 10th hour I play it, is the game even fun? Am I actually like enjoying it? No. If I spend 60 hours a week playing a video game, do I have more fun or less fun than if I play a game for 6 hours a week? So first thing you've got to do, reset your dopamine. So we've done videos, we've had Discord events about dopamine detoxes. We've also debunked other dopamine detoxes, which are largely BS. But you've got to reset your dopamine. So what I'd say is for 2 weeks, drastically decrease or cut out YouTube, social media, Twitch, gaming. Because you've got to reset your nucleus accumbens. Once your nucleus accumbens resets, hopefully your ventromedial prefrontal cortex will start to calm down. As it'll calm down, you'll start to feel negative emotions. So y'all aren't wrong. The second thing you need to do is become aware of negative emotions. So if we paid attention to this person's post, they were saying like, you're not completely numb, right? You just feel a lot less than what you should. So when you feel something negative, try to understand what you're feeling. Really try to increase your emotional awareness. And what you'll tend to find is that when you become aware of your negative emotion, even the smallest negative emotion, what you're going to find is that there's a response to the negative emotion. And when you have this response to the negative emotion, there's going to be a reflexive action. So when I'm feeling sad, without even realizing it, I'm going to start browsing Reddit. And guess what this reflexive action does? Messes up your dopamine. So ironically, feeling more anxious is actually the right answer. So there are going to be small moments throughout the day where you experience emotions. Observe the emotion. And most importantly, acknowledge what it is, and then don't stop the reflexive action. And as you stop the reflexive action, the emotion will increase. It'll feel a little bit uncomfortable. But since your brain is pretty good at numbing, it's going to be a slow process of letting it out little bit by little bit by little bit. And as you stop the reflexive action, you're going to stop messing with your dopamine. And so we sort of see that it'll sort of fix the problem. The problem with this is that as you fix the problem, what are you actually going to experience? You're going to feel more negative emotion. So be aware of that. And as you feel more negative emotion, the good news is that you'll feel more positive emotion. And then you'll recalibrate. So it's interesting because we see this kind of situation a lot nowadays where people are numb. And then they think about anhedonia. They're like, oh man, it sounds like I'm anhedonic. So one thing that we should also say is that if you are anhedonic, this is not a good idea. You should probably go see a provider and get evaluated. Because if you have a clinical illness that is causing the anhedonia, because remember that neuropharmacology of anhedonia and major depressive disorder, there are two different things that could be going on. You could be depressed or you could not be depressed. The pathway for each of those things is different. You could definitely do this one as well if you're depressed, but there's a whole other set of stuff that's going on in the case of actual depression, right? And how we assess anhedonia and how we treat anhedonia. So you should get a clinical evaluation, but then recognize this cycle, that the numbness is through hyperactive activity of the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which is to compensate for a hypoactive nucleus accumbens. And then once your nucleus accumbens, by the way, is hypoactive, you're going to have trouble with motivation as well. So you don't enjoy things as much. And then you try to balance that negativity by activating your prefrontal cortex. The thing is, when you activate that prefrontal cortex, it suppresses your negative emotion as well. And so you end up being completely numb. And you can reverse that cycle through, first of all, dopamine detox goes a long way. But secondly, awareness of the negative emotion and not distracting yourself or suppressing that negative emotion through the reflexive action. The problem is that when you stop suppressing it, you're going to start feeling more. And that's going to be too much to handle. So you got to learn how to swim in more chaotic waters, right? You got to get out of the kiddie pool and get into the big pool. And then eventually get into a pond, get into a lake, get into a river, and get into the ocean. The ocean of emotion, baby. Make sense? And it's really weird because you don't even feel worried about it, right? You know it's a problem, but you don't feel worried about it. And so then what do? All right, how was that for speed run? Okay? So as Ben is asking, but what if I feel too much emotion? So that's something that we've dealt with a lot more on stream. So we've got a ton of resources about, so Dr. K's guide, for example, talks a lot about anxiety, right? And how to like control anxiety. There are different emotional techniques, by the way. So different meditations to feel more emotion and different techniques to feel less emotion. So hopefully that's pretty much covered elsewhere. Yeah, so Drop Me Stuff is saying TLDR meditate. I hate to break it to y'all, but half of what we do on this channel is to try to convince y'all to meditate. Like, it's really meditation and exercise are the two things that basically help every dimension of your life. So this is just a long slog to try to trick y'all into meditating. All right, who are we rating today, chat? And while we're figuring this out, we've got a couple of announcements. So we've got something really cool starting in July. So in July, we're going to be running a social sandbox on Discord as part of the Touch Grass initiative. So Touch Grass is a really cool initiative that's being started on our Discord to help y'all get out of the house. So it's essentially like a contest that involves, I think, taking pictures of stuff, basically. And so we're going to gamify the whole experience. You're going to gain points for doing things like going outside or with people. You can climb the leaderboard, and there are going to be rewards that we'll be sharing with y'all soon. And also, if you're terrified of socializing and need a place to practice, there's a social sandbox part of our Discord. It's led by an HG coach, and we're going to offer practical tips and a chance to role play and practice social interactions with other community members. We're literally creating a sandbox for y'all to be able to practice socializing in. And it's going to be facilitated by a coach. Okay? Right? So we want y'all to get out during the month of July and touch grass and do things. And so hopefully y'all will do that. We don't quite have a date on the new guide yet, but the filming is complete. So yeah, so join the Discord for details. So this is what we try to do, y'all. We will so I can teach y'all stuff, right? So we did like a lecture today and things like that. But in terms of some of the actions and implementation, that's why we have things like coaching and Discord. And we recognize that coaching isn't for everyone, also financially may not be for everyone. So that's why we try to have a Discord where y'all can go and do stuff. And it's like everything on the Discord, as far as I know, is free, right? So we have different kinds of workshops and stuff like that. And so, this is the kind of stuff where like you can practice, like literally practice speaking to people, get facilitated by a coach, and like do things like have a reason to go outside, right? We'll gamify the experience so that you can like literally leave these four walls and go outside and do something. And Healthy Gamer is what it is, not because of Dr. K. Dr. K is an important part of it, like don't get me wrong, but it's really what it is because of y'all, right? Like Dr. K could be streaming on Twitch, and if there was 0 viewers and no one ever watched my videos, like Healthy Gamer wouldn't be a thing. Does that make sense? It is what it is because of you. And Discord is the place that y'all are you the best. And so we try to sort of encourage accountability, action taking. We can talk about this stuff and you can watch Twitch and YouTube forever. But at some point you got to start doing stuff. And that's why we have like basically like, different, like depending on how much you are willing to do. If you don't want to sign up for group coaching to overcome shyness and communication problems, that's totally fine. Start with the Discord if that's what you can handle. If you're more committed and you're like 12 weeks from now, I want to have made significant progress as opposed to a one-off social sandbox kind of thing, then sign up for group. right? So depending on where you are, we're going to meet you. A big part of our philosophy is meet people where they're at. It's part of the reason that I spent less time seeing patients in my office and more time streaming on Twitch. And rather than trying to convince you to come into the office, we're going to try to do our best to meet y'all where you're at. And so if you want to just put your feet in the water but don't want to jump in, Discord is a fantastic place. You can go there, check it out, engage in what means something to you, what you're interested in. No commitment. But we'd love to see you there. And I think you'll really enjoy it. So check out our Discord. Yeah, so Tech Teller just confirmed Discord is free. Will there be future lectures on cluster B disorders? Eventually. I'd love to talk about that. I'd love to do a deep dive into narcissism in particular. Seni K4. Okay, let's see. Oh, Fall Guys is back? Okay, let's do it. Okay, we're rating Seni. Oh, crap. Hold on. I got to do it this way. Raid channel. You want to raid Gorp? Okay, let's raid Gorp. Okay, we'll raid Gorp. All right. Take care, chat. Love y'all.